This is The Mud Peddlers, a podcast where two nerdy ceramic artists share the behind the scenes of their worlds of clay. We are your hosts, Lindsey M. Dillon.
And I am Donte of Earth Nation.
This week on The Mud Peddlers, we're extremely excited about this. We have Ben Carter, and you may know him in a lot of different ways because, as we were talking about before the podcast started, he's got his fingers in many different pies and everything is delicious and everybody's well fed. So, Ben Carter, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into clay and how you got into podcasting?
Yes. Well, thank you guys for having me. I really am glad to be here. And it's also good to see you guys because I hear you in the podcast, but it's not, it's not the same. So
It's not.
Absolutely.
I'm honored to be here. I started in high school, actually, which thankfully in Virginia, where I went to school, we had really good ceramics programs. So I took about maybe 5 or 6 ceramics classes before I ever graduated. So I got hooked. I mean, it's probably the same story as you guys. Like, I started working and I was like, nah, I'm just going to do this for the rest of my life. But that I said when I was 15, so I got hooked early and have been hooked ever since.
I think that's a story for a lot of people because, like, I took so many classes in college that sooner or later my teacher was like, let's go look at kilns online. Let's just go look at kilns. And I'm like, oh, I'd like one of those. He's like, yeah, I bet you would. Yeah. Yeah.
Showing the path. This is the way.
He was just ahead of me. He was just like, I realize what you're just going to do the same thing that I'm doing now. I'm just going to get you set up so that it's less difficult for you. Yeah. So I'm really thankful to ceramics arts programs, whether high school or college, that really push students that were going to be interested in art anyway towards that path. Mm-hmm. I'm glad that they create people like Ben and I.
Yeah, Ben, did you have anyone at that point in your life who was like encouraging you to follow this path? Because I know for a lot of young folks, they go like, "Oh, I want to go into the arts." There's a lot of social pressure to be like, "Oh, haha, starving artist." So did you have anyone who was, yeah. Who did you have in your life who kind of, or did you have anyone in your life, whether it's a teacher, parent, or anybody who like kind of helped get over that cultural hump?
I did. My high school art teachers were both really sort of pushing me into the arts, whether that was clay or not. They didn't necessarily push me towards clay, but they really let me know from 15 years old onward that being an artist was a good thing that gave something back to the community. Mm-hmm. And that was something that was really important for me early on because I was like every 15-year-old. I felt isolated, alone, all the things that teenagers feel. I was feeling that. And they were basically saying, well, if you make a life in the arts, you're going to give something to your community and you'll also be able to form a community, which for me, like I really needed that. And we mentioned path earlier, like we're all on this path. They were the first people to tell me like, it's a path, like you do this step and then you go to school. So they recommended Appalachian State. That was about maybe 3 hours from where I was living. And from there, I just went on and on and on because that Appalachian State is also close to the Penland School of Craft. So that was like a whole nother thing that I could then go from there. So they laid out the path and they really kind of gave me a little nudge, like, just do it,
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
It's so nice when things come together like that because, like, I essentially lived like 2 miles away from the industrial mineral company that makes clay and handles a lot of minerals. And anytime there's a mineral change, the owner of the shop knows me well enough to be like, we're changing pits again, So like, here's the chemical analysis, do whatever you do with your stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't think when I was a kid, I would have ever been like, man, if I get into art, I really hope I live next to a mineral company. So it's easier for me to, because there's some people who don't have that privilege, They don't have like the college down the street that has a really good arts program.
Yeah.
And everything kind of came together, thankfully.
One of the things that I struggled with a lot, like once I graduated from college, like I was shown the path up to like college. And then once I graduated, it was like, oh hells, how do I actually make this a living? And it's been, the last like 10 plus years or so of kind of trying to figure that out. But where I've sort of ended up is that my my tolerance for stress and financial instability is no longer compatible with being self-employed. So I'm in the process of looking for basically doing like the dual career thing. So having a stable job and then doing ceramics more on the side. But you've been able to continue to make it a thing. So I guess what I'm trying to ask, this long preamble, is how that path of yours developed after graduation and whether you made that path yourself, whether you continue to have kind of folks help show you how to make working in the arts sustainable. And yeah, what was that like after you graduated and as you were kind of in the early part of your career, figuring out how you wanted to make this a workable living?
I think ceramics is a spaghetti career, meaning that like you throw spaghetti at the wall and you see what sticks. And for me, I've tried all sorts of things. I've tried being predominantly a teacher. I've tried being predominantly a teacher in a workshop setting. So not one employer, but, teaching workshops and multiple employers. I've tried just doing podcasting. I've tried just making pots. And I think my career has ended up being a blend of all those things. But if I could talk to my younger self, I would just say, do it again. It's confusing. You're never going to know where the money comes from, but it didn't mean you were doing it wrong. Because the way I used to feel is like, I must be doing this wrong. Shouldn't this be easier? And as I talk to my friends and talk to folks like y'all, like you're nodding your head in acknowledgement that like, actually, no, it's not easier. Even if you diversify your income streams and you have all these different hats that you wear in the ceramic field, no sort of bucket of money in your life is that big. So you have to keep getting more and more buckets of money to make like the bigger nest egg that, actually can sustain you. So
Right.
I've kind of gone in and out of having other jobs, everything from being a dog walker. Like when I was in California, I used to live in Santa Cruz. I don't know if I ever told you guys that.
What? Oh my
Don't get
God.
excited, Lindsey.
No,
Don't get
I'm so
excited.
excited. I went to school at UC Santa Cruz.
Oh,
Oh my
no.
God. When were you in Santa Cruz?
I was there from 2013 to 2019.
You were there when I graduated. I graduated in 2013. This is so exciting. Go banana slugs. Anyway.
The banana slug is
Sorry, carry
real.
on.
If you go hiking in the mountains
Mhm.
around there, you will see banana slugs, which I thought was made up. I thought it was like just something goofy.
Yeah,
thought so
mean,
too.
for Santa Cruz makes
Yeah,
sense.
totally legit. But when I lived there was this unique financial situation where, us being poor, that wasn't the unique part. Like we were just poor. You know what it's like to live in Santa Cruz. Like it's expensive.
Oh yeah, very expensive.
But there was an opportunity for me to be a dog walker. So literally, I would walk the dogs for the people that owned Netflix, and
Oh my
they
God.
paid us so much money. They were one of our clients. We had a whole bunch of different clients, and I worked for a dog walking company. And I used to feel like really bummed, like, oh, I'm supposed to be a professional potter, but I can't make a living, and I'm walking dogs.
Just a dog walker, though, making so much money off of dog walking.
I could get paid $50 an hour to walk dogs.
Oh
Oh my
God.
God.
Oh
Put some rollerblades on and call it cash.
God. Yeah.
God.
Yeah. Oh man. So that's an example of where I was doing something that didn't fit the romantic idea, because I had this romance about like, oh, you're just supposed to live in the woods and have a pottery studio and make a living selling your, $46 mug. And that wasn't the reality. My reality is that I've had to do a little of everything just to be able to put it together. But the way I figured it out was trial and error and panic, sheer panic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you still panicking, or do you feel like you've kind of set things up in a way where it feels sustainable?
It does feel more sustainable now. And I only panic on occasion, which I feel like is progress. It's like we want progress, not perfection, right? Like
Ooh,
Right.
it's
yeah,
okay to have a little panic,
yeah.
but not absolute panic all the time. And actually, what has helped me is my wife does not think about money the same way that I do. Her risk tolerance is a lot lower than mine. So where I was I almost said unemployed, is I was
Oh.
self-employed, which sometimes are similar, but that are actually different.
They sure are similar
Yes.
sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah,
In between jobs.
exactly.
Oh.
As I was perpetually self-employed, she started talking about things like, hey, we need to have a prudent reserve, which is where you save up 3 or 6 months worth of expenses so that if all hell breaks loose, you don't have to panic because you've got 3 to 6 months to figure it out.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I needed her calm, rational financial sense to help me get out of panicking.
Before I was like a ceramic art teacher, I used to be a chef, and I had this one guy who made all my soups. He was my soup guy, right? And he had the philosophy of like, men like me should not handle money. I make money, I bring it to my wife, and she figures out all the finances.
Oh.
And I'm like, really? He's like, yes, we have like a year in reserve and we have stocks. And he's like, I just want to make soup. That's all I want to do. And I was like, oh yeah, that's the dream right there. Collect it, and somebody else will kind of like spread it out, you know?
And actually, this is kind of a good advice if you're starting a business, is that even if you don't have that second person, you can divide your life up to studio time is one thought process where you're creative and you take a lot of risks. And then your financial life, you treat more like a 9 to 5 job. And you literally like schedule, like I'm going to do my bookkeeping Mondays at 10 a.m. And you clock into the bookkeeper part of your career and you treat that in a much more regimented way than you do in the studio. Because I find that like those parts, I guess it's right brain, left brain thinking. Like my creativity is better when I have some structure, but if I get too much structure, that also makes me anxious. So I've learned to like,
It kills it.
yeah, exactly. I've had to like take
Yeah.
some of the boundaries away. But then if I have no structure in my financial management, like my wife is just pissed because I'm not making good decisions.
Can't have that.
Yeah.
I think the way us pottery people are built is, you're right. Like this comes very naturally to us in the studio. So if there's too much structure, there's not enough freedom to express ourselves within the art world. But as far as like bookkeeping, I think you're right. It's very like, I have to make an intent to bookkeep. I have to keep track of my sales on purpose. Maybe for business majors, that in turn comes naturally because it's just simple math. But like I have to kind of like get in the mood, light a couple candles to do the bookkeeping, you know? Being in the studio is like I could just live in put a bed in here and I'll figure it out, you know?
That's one of my little soapbox things, is always that I wish and I feel that if you are getting a degree in arts, I feel like you should have a mandatory like business minor as a part of that, because there
Yeah.
are so many things that like you end up having to learn after you graduate from college, or after you know, are kind of, because again, obviously not everybody goes to college, but like after you're kind of in that initial like learning ceramics as a material. Once you kind of get to the point where you can start making money on some stuff, then you're kind of like, oh wait, how do I actually go about that? Since podcasting is such a huge part of what you do, like how have you made podcasting profitable? Because I think like I remember when we all went to NCECA, I guess that was 2 years ago now in Cincinnati.
2-ish. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like even since then there's been like podcasts in general have become a bigger part of the ceramics kind of world and community in general. And with the Brickyard Network, like that's the first thing like that I feel like any of us have kind of been exposed to, like, oh yeah, this is like a network of ceramic podcasters. And so I'm really curious, like what inspired you to make that? And then how have you been able to continue to have it grow and make it worth your time and effort? Because you were just talking about your experience of like, you know, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And sometimes it's hard to know, like, okay, the noodle is slipping, but it's still on the wall. Do we pick it? Do we pick it off and throw another, or do we just keep, you know? So anyway, to not stretch this metaphor too far, how have you navigated that, and what was it like creating the Brickyard Network?
The Brickyard Network came out of a desire to help other people get into podcasting. Because y'all know, like, this is the fun part where we're talking. What the listener doesn't see is like the 10 plus hours we're going to spend editing just this audio to make something that sounds halfway decent and makes it sound like we're not idiots and that we know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think for me, there's only so much hope with not sounding like an idiot, but I try. No. No amount of editing and post will fix that.
Well, what I realized is that the editing is what kept people from starting podcasts, you know, because they were scared. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't know how to pay someone else to do it. They didn't know how to even, I mean, most clay people, like they know way more about a clay recipe than they do about a WAV file or like any sound thing. So I had already developed these skills by having my own podcast, which is Tales of a Red Clay Rambler. That started in 2012. And we didn't start the Brickyard Network until 2021. So I had, you know, I had a lot of experience, and I knew I can teach people how to be a host. I can teach people how to edit. I can teach people how to do any of those things. And if they can't edit, I'll edit for them. And it turns out that that's what happens. I just do all the editing because it's faster.
Yeah.
Bless you. Bless you. You're doing the Lord's work.
That's right.
That's the hard part of the editing, really.
And it's the thing that like I can now edit a podcast that used to take me say 8 to 10 hours. I can do it in like 2 hours because I know, and it's probably same with y'all. You know what you're listening for. So the whole
Yeah.
process is just easier and better. So then it became a question of how do I get someone else to fund us? You know, because I kind of already knew I wanted these hosts. I wanted these hosts. Like I was building it was like building a roster for a sports team. You know, like in my head, I was
Yeah.
like, oh, we need this person. We need this person. We need this person. And thankfully I was going to start a nonprofit, and I had called Steve Lee, who was the director of the Archie Bray at that point.
Mhm.
And I asked him to be on the board of this nonprofit that I was going to start. And he was like, don't start a nonprofit. Like it takes so much time and so much paperwork, because once you have that legal entity, whatever state it's based in, you just have to go through state regulation after state regulation. Why don't you just come and work for the Bray and we'll fund the network? So it was essentially what I was looking for, which was a big pot of money to work from. And we've been with the Bray ever since. So that was 2021. We're about 3, I guess technically we launched in August of 21. I was working on it before that, but we've been releasing weekly episodes of up to about 6 or 7 shows, depending on the yearly schedule ever since then.
That's the dream right there, you know?
Yeah.
I have a couple weird questions, if you don't mind, coming off of your podcast, right? So like, are you primarily a Red Clay person and that's why you named your podcast that way? Or what came up with the name?
I'm from Southwest Virginia, where we literally have red clay in the ground everywhere. So if
Right.
you go and you're like trying to put a fence in your yard and you dig down more than 6 inches, the chances of you hitting red clay is really high. So I've just grown up with so much red clay. And then when I started, making pots, I used stoneware, I used porcelain, I used all these high fire things. But when I moved to low fire and I found red terracotta, it felt like I was like coming home, because it was the aesthetic that I was used to. I also grew up in a town with a brick factory. So brick, clay, bricks themselves, like all of that was
Red
just
brick everywhere.
exactly. So Red Clay Rambler was just my love for clay and how I talk a lot. So that's basically where that came from.
I think it's a good name. And also you had mentioned briefly that you work in the low fire range. Is that your usual range, or did you work at like 10 for a while, 6 for a while, and then you were like, no, low fire is good. I like this the most.
Yeah, I've been working almost exclusively in low fire since about 2006. So I started off at Cone 6, and then that was in high school. And thankfully, that was a good foundation. Like I actually learned glaze chemistry when I was in high school. Like we had a really good program. And so I started at Cone 6. Then in college at Appalachian State, I did Cone 10. I later went on to graduate school at the University of Florida. I was doing Cone 10 soda, doing some wood firing, soda firing, but then it was at University of Florida, and actually a little bit before that I first started using low fire materials, and all of my graduate work was really focused on understanding low fire materials and kind of getting a foundation for working at what most people think of low fire as commercial glaze, but there's actually tons and tons and tons of mix in your own studio glazes that are from Cone 04 up to Cone 3, which is kind of what I think of low fire being.
Yeah, definitely. Lindsey and I don't really work at like low fire, so I put together my own glazes for most of my life, and then of course I took the ceramic material workshop class, and now I think in molar amounts. like I wrote an entire blog on like red iron saturated khaki reds because they're so infuriating at Cone 6 that I spent like a year of my life trying to understand what makes a good red. But when I talk to other people who haven't really had the classes, they're like, I'm not doing all that. Like I'm not doing molar amounts. I'm like, you have to. And like, nope, no. And so it's good to know that there's people out there who I feel so alone. I go to NCCA just to talk about this stuff.
Oh, totally. Yeah, because our spouses don't give a shit about molar amounts.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
They don't.
Unless it's the molars in
don't.
your mouth that are whatever you're getting at the dentist.
Yeah, look, babe, I got this red. This one came out. She's like, it looks like
Oh
the last one.
God.
No, this one's a little more red.
Yeah, yeah. Look at the crystals. The microcrystals are
Talc,
just a little
we
bit
changed over
bigger.
from
Like,
talc. We changed talc. I have to use Simbar talc now. I can't use the last talc I used. And she's like, I don't know who Simbar
oh.
is. And I'm like, never mind. Never mind.
Dear any spouses who are listening to this podcast because your partner has it on in the background, thank you for your love and support.
Bro, just pretend for us, please. Just be like, oh, give us the 5-year-old treatment. Like, oh, that's nice.
That's all we need. Pat on the
Oh my
back. Just a
God.
little attaboy. That's all you need.
Yep, absolutely. Coming back to working with low fire clays, like because red clay was such a part or is such a part of that part of the United States, but there can also sometimes be like institutional pressures to work with like high fire because there's that like fine art versus craft sort of dichotomy that can show up. Did you deal with any of that when you were either in your MFA or in your master's program and afterwards? Was that something you had to deal with at all?
Sure. Yeah. And I dealt with it at the institutional level. Like I've definitely taught places where I show up to teach a workshop and they're like, you're going to teach low fire? Like they're confused. Like they automatically assume like if I'm a traveling workshop teacher that I might be teaching, something different. But now I've also dealt with it, funnily enough, with the buying audience. So when I'm talking to people at shows that want to buy the pots and I start talking about low fire, the first thing that they ask is like, is this strong enough to be used? And so a lot of my career has just been explaining glaze technology and clay technology to people in a way that's accessible and that makes them or helps them to understand that no matter what temperature range you're firing to, you need to get as close to vitrification as possible. You need to have a glaze that matures. Like all these principles of strong pots can apply at any temperature level. And if you do them wrong, you can have a cone tin pot that's not a great pot, that's going to fail in the microwave.
Crazed, it breaks 2 years later just because it went down to the structure of the pot.
Yeah, so I think for me, I've dealt with some of that by educating people. And I think of myself as like the string that holds all of my life together is educating people because I'm passionate about the things I've learned. So the book that I've written recently about low fire, I talked to 93 different artists about what they do at low fire. So it's a really broad spectrum of people that are all making pots, sculpture, a little of everything. But I'm trying to put this information out into the world so that the book can sort of stand in for me when I'm not there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
What was the process like writing your books? I mean, because you have the two out, and of course we'll be listing links for those in the show notes, so our dear listeners can give them a look. But like, so between writing the first book and the second book, because I think if I remember correctly, they're different publishers. So what was that like, and what were things that you learned from maybe your first experience writing the book that helped you prepare for writing your second?
Yeah, the first book was about throwing, and that was something that I felt really comfortable with. Throughout all of my different research at different glaze temperatures, the thing that I was always doing was throwing the pots, like that was the core. So writing a book about that, I felt like I could do it. And it's interesting that you bring up the publishers because actually the reason I went with the bigger company of Quarto, that's like the biggest company, they actually own multiple different imprints, which is like a smaller publishing company that they publish under. But the reason that I went with them is because the publisher that I first worked with used to be in Asheville, North Carolina and work at Lark Books, which people will know because they did this whole series of like 500 bowls, 500 pictures.
Yeah, of course. Those became staples in the community studio at my community college.
I have those in my studio. Well, not this, the other studio that I work at. There's like all the 500 this, 500 that. Yeah.
Yeah, they were just ubiquitous in ceramics, and that was one publisher in Asheville, but they actually started to back away from ceramics. So Quarto sort of stepped in to fill the gap. So when I wrote that first book, this was the first ceramic book that Quarto had published in a while. So I was kind of their guinea pig, and thankfully it turned out well. And it turned out well enough that it's the start. It's called Mastering the Potter's Wheel, and it's the start of a series of 5 books that are all hand building, kiln firing, tile. I'm trying to think of the fifth. The fifth, I think, is a glaze book. Yeah, all from other authors. But for me, writing the first book, like I would not have picked myself as a writer. I mean, there's a reason I do a podcast and not, not, something written. Not that I couldn't write. It's just that I didn't think of myself as a writer. And I've taught myself how to write in a structured way through writing the first book. So that's what I took on to the second book, is I knew I could write a book. And even now, like if you guys pitch me a book, I can go write it for you if you want me to. You know, like it's a skill that I've kind of refined and I've built confidence the same way as when we all first started making pots. Like we couldn't guarantee that anything out of those first kiln loads was going to be good. But now I think with writing, like I trust my writing skills. I trust my wife's editing. You know, she often is the editor for the books. So if something's not making sense, she generally knows ceramics, but she doesn't know it in detail. So if something doesn't make sense, she'll tell me like, this is not clear. You need to write more about this. And that outside eye is really helpful.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, especially because like we can, kind of speaking about molar amounts, it's like sometimes we can end up even just like on the podcast, like using language that is, it's like the deeper you get into any particular subject, the more it develops its own specific vocabulary, and that can end up turning off people who are trying to learn that particular subject because they're like not only having to learn the subject itself, but like the vocabulary around that subject. Even like, oh yeah, firing to cone 6. Wait, are there cones in the kiln? Like traffic cones? Like what? So yeah. I think that's awesome that your wife is able to kind of fill that role for you as well.
Yeah, the editing program I crutch heavy on because like I can't spell for anything. So regardless of how well my stuff is structured, if I don't say it correctly or if there's not a comma in the right place. But through writing my blogs, I've gained enough experience to go like, oh no, that wouldn't sound right to someone reading it in their head. So it has to be restructured. But with the amount of experience in like glaze chemistry I know, in my brain, I'm like, I could put that. That makes sense to me, but that would only make sense to people like me, And the average is to get the most people who just don't understand it to understand it on some level. I get where you're coming from. Like, I'm not a born writer yet. It's a learned skill for sure.
Yeah. Are there skills that you want to be working on right now? Like, is there something that you feel that you want to do to expand your business, put your finger in another pie, so to speak, that you're kind of beginning to learn? And like when you are learning something new, I guess, sorry, there's two different questions here.
What are you working on and what do you want to be working on?
Yes. And
what are you working on right now? And
the other question I have will be a separate question, but yes, first question first. Thank you, Donte.
What do you want to be working on later once you're done working on the stuff you got to work on?
Well, right now I'm working on some new surfaces. So like all potters, like you find a new glaze and you're like, ooh, it's like you're like Gollum, like polishing the ring. You're like, this satin glaze is like so perfect. But the funny thing about glaze is, as you guys know, is like subtle differences in temperature or chemistry or application, like all these things matter. So through writing the book, I got to talk to this is the second book that I wrote, the Low Fire Complete Guide to Low Fire Glazes for Potters and Sculptors. I got to do all this different research and see what people were doing. And the thing that I'm really hip on right now is satin glazes. So something in which you can see through the surface, but there's a crystallization happening that's going to provide something that's not glossy. So I'm really like trying to dial in like how much opacity do you need so that it's a separate surface than the underglaze decoration that I'm putting underneath the glaze. Because I want it to be 3 distinct layers. There's the slip layer, the underglaze layer, and the glaze layer. So if I want it to be like, this is a weird analogy, but if you ever look into a pond in which there's fish, you can always see the top of the pond, the fish, and the bottom of the pond. Like I want the pot to have that sense of like floating depth that's kind of changing as you turn the pot around.
That's such a good way of putting that. Oh, that's interesting.
That's a great analogy. Is it for you? Is it just a measurement of dialing in the alumina? Because is that satin layer just alumina?
Depending on which glaze you're talking about, it is silica to alumina ratios that kind of mess with that. But what I've found, instead of messing with all the chemistry, is to just change the temperature I'm going to. So for instance, a really good, robust terracotta pot that has low absorption and is close to vitrification, but not actually vitrified, would be somewhere in that cone 1 to cone 2 range. So I'm firing successively hotter to try to get that to happen for the clay. But when I fire these satin glazes hotter and hotter and hotter, they tend to gloss out. So then I have to like readjust. Like, do I then increase alumina to silica like you're talking about, Dante? Or do I settle for like cone O2 and it's a little lower? The clay's a little less dense, but the glaze is like just perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, oh.
Do you find that they're finicky enough to where, like, if you put them in a different space in your kiln, like the hot spot in your kiln versus the normal spot, will they differ? Like, they're sensitive, huh? Yeah. Okay, man.
I don't know if it's the kiln. I got the elements in my kiln repaired, and I don't have cool spots anymore.
Oh.
Oh,
You know, it's pretty even,
yeah.
which is great. But then now I've had to learn how to control these things with application and temperature. So what I've noticed is like a much, much thicker coat of the glaze I'm working with now is going to tend to be glossy in a different way than a thinner coat. So I'm just trying to kind of figure out like, I mean, all this stuff is like clay 101. So it's funny that 30 years into this career, I'm still figuring out like, for this glaze, how long do I dip the pot?
I
Yeah.
mean,
You know, it's
makes
so simple.
it makes so much sense though, because it really is. It's like it almost kind of reminds me of like this is gonna be such a geeky comparison, but like I can't remember. Ben, do you play D&D at all, Dungeons and Dragons?
You know, I don't, but my wife is huge into it, so I'm very familiar.
Okay. So it kind of
We can talk to his wife about it.
yes. So it kind of reminds me like working in clay kind of reminds me of like going through a D&D campaign because like you start out at level 1, but you're like killing rats in a basement, right? And then it's like you get to higher and higher levels, higher and higher levels, higher and higher levels. And like you're still fighting, you're still casting spells, you're still doing all the same things that you're doing at level 1, but you're like fighting a god instead. And I feel like ceramics is that
Yeah.
same way because there's all these basic skills that we acquire when we first learn, but then the more skilled you get, you're still applying those same base skills, but it's like in more complicated settings to get different kind of results than what you're trying to get when you're first starting out to some degree.
Way more depth every time. It's like when you develop a glaze, like the glaze that I've been developing over the last year or so, I finally got to really work for me. And if I change the amount of alkali metal up by like 1, if it's like 2476 versus like 2377, it's a world of like it won't develop the crystals that I need it to develop. But that's like basic chemistry stuff. It's like, well, yeah, that's the flux of the primary melters, and then there's the secondary melters, but like 2 grams off. 2 grams of a material in a glaze of a 100-gram batch will make an entirely different glaze. And then you have to deal with absorption and how you layer it on the pot. And then you have to deal with your heat. And then if you just changed your thermocouple, like I want it to be regulated. I want it to be regulated so bad.
Oh my God. Well, that sort of comes to the second half of that question that I wanted to ask is like when you are interested in learning something new and like trying to either develop a new technique or like add something new to your business, like how do you make decisions about what you're going to spend time and investment on? Because I think like one of the things that Dante and I are always talking about in our business is like trying to figure out like when is the juice worth the squeeze? And for myself, I'll say that like
Yeah.
I feel like when I was younger, like in my early 20s and stuff, I felt much more okay with kind of like flopping around and trying to figure things out because I was like, hey, I'm in my 20s, like this is kind of what we do. But now there's this sense of like, oh, like the timeline feels shorter because it's like I'm in my 30s now, like I'm kind of in a different spot in my life. Like I feel like the things that I decide to invest my time in, I feel like I need to know sooner if the juice is worth the squeeze, but I also know that's kind of an absurd thing to try and figure out because we never know what the future is going to hold. So how do you navigate that now that you're, further along into your career, you feel more stable in general, but there's still so many things that you like could do both in terms of your studio practice and your business. How do you navigate that space?
I think the juice is always worth the squeeze because it tastes good. Like juice, or in this case, in this analogy, energy, like the sense of passion you have in the studio, it's always worth the squeeze. It doesn't, though, however, mean I got to dedicate my life to that one thing if it doesn't work. So I tend to follow my passion. And in that way, if you could get a bird's eye view for me, you might think I'm going in like nonsensical directions because I am often following my passion for like a glaze, like a specific glaze or a surface I want. But then there's a second part that kicks into my brain, which is that if I'm going to repeat this over and over and over again, what's the chances I'm going to get a sellable pot? And the thing that's changed over time is that I give up on glaze combinations or a glaze issue faster than I used to.
Yeah.
Like I used to spend like a year trying to refine something really simple, when now I've realized like actually maybe I'm looking at the problem incorrectly. Maybe the problem is not I need to use glaze A, but more that I need to make pots with stable glazes that don't craze. And I might use glaze B, C, D, E, F, G. It doesn't matter what glaze I use as long as the outcome is a stable pot that's a sellable pot.
Okay, yeah.
So it's kind of like a two-part thought process. Like I follow the passion first, and then I try to focus on what needs to happen to repeat the process to make more pots and to be able to sell them.
Right. No, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Like just knowing when to kind of abandon ship, honestly, is a valuable skill. Knowing when to stop, rather. A lot of my students say, because they'll work on a pot for a while, they'll mess it up because they overwork on it. And knowing when to stop is like its own skill.
Oh, so true. So true. We're getting a little bit close to the end, but there was one question that I wanted to ask, like specifically about the Brickyard Network. And like I was listening earlier actually to your episode with PJ Anderson and as I was researching everything that the Brickyard Network does and the podcast that it supports, one of the things I really appreciated is that it supports a lot of podcasts that are run by folks of color. And I think as anyone who's gone to NCECA knows, like the ceramic space can be pretty like white dominated. So I wanted to ask like what all the Brickyard Network does to support folks of color to help kind of elevate the voices of folks of color in this historically and predominantly like white dominated space, and then how you kind of just how you navigate that.
In our mission, we were founded with the idea that we would support underrepresented voices in ceramics. And one of the facts of the historical record in ceramics is that it's often more white and more male than the actual on-the-ground experiences that people have in art centers and in schools. So occasionally you'll hear things like, there weren't a lot of black potters in the 70s, or there weren't a lot of Hispanic potters in the 90s, or, you'll hear people make these assumptions, but the reality was there were plenty of black, Hispanic, any group of people. There were plenty of people on the ground making pots, being influential, teaching, having students, but no one was writing the articles about them, and no one was writing books about them. What they were writing books about was whoever the hotshot, usually man, was at the time. So like I can find you dozens of articles about Peter Voulkos, who was a influential person, in Montana, California. He worked in a lot of different areas, but there's books about him. There's like all these things about him. And I don't want to take away from what he did, but like, was he actually that much more influential than someone like Patty Warashina, who was a sculptor and she taught in Washington, in Seattle? Like the research I've done on her, it seems to me like the difference between how famous she is because she was an Asian woman and who was writing about her, not what she was making. Because when I could show you stuff that she made in literally 1981, 82, 83, that's mind-blowing, that seems ahead of its time.
Yeah.
But there was not anyone there to tell her story. And she is like a clay superstar. So people have actually written about her some, but let's take a couple steps removed, someone that's not a famous gallery level sculptor. Let's talk about someone in your art center in Sacramento.
Yeah.
You could probably find people in the 80s, 90s, 2000s that are artists of color that were super influential, but no one wrote their story. No one asked them to do a podcast and talk about their lives in their own voice. So the network is really about like, how do we actually capture the breadth of what's happening in the ceramics world? And we specifically ask people to be hosts that are super smart.
Yeah.
So the super smart people that we ask are often artists of color, and the people they're interviewing and the conversations they have are just very different than the conversations that you or I might be having.
Of course, yeah.
So the diversity of hosts creates diversity of interviews. That's one of the principles that we work under.
Yeah, which is kind of what you need, realistically speaking. Like you need different perspectives from different walks of life to make a complete picture. And taking from one pot of one type of person is never going to give you like good enough representation to complete your artistic journey, really. It's like,
Yeah. And I feel like so often the ways, I'll speaking for myself, like the way that I learned about the history of ceramics from like a non-Western perspective is all like ancient pottery, ancient, stuff. And it's like, oh, no, 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 like these folks are still around. It's not like even just like, gosh, just the beginning of the conversation that you had with PJ Anderson today. I'm still like holding on to it because you have this question about like the dichotomy between like traditional methods and modern methods. And so often what we think of as modern methods are actually really traditional. And then I think tying that into like just the history of who is practicing what techniques, where, how that's viewed in terms of the perceived value of those things, and then how the history of that is taught. Anyway, it's really interesting. And I'm curious, like for folks who are more interested in learning about the underrepresented folks in ceramics history, because I think, again, like Brickyard Network is doing a really good job of highlighting contemporary voices. But how would you recommend folks who are interested in learning about ceramics history, but from a like not just purely white male centered, cis centered like perspective? How would you recommend folks begin that journey?
If they want to start with a podcast, I'd recommend Clay and Color, which is Angelique Viscarando-Laboy and Alex Anderson. They're interviewing generally younger artists of color that are working in what they think about as the aesthetics of cuteness. So like references to anime, references to pop culture, all these things that were traditionally looked down as lowbrow, like in the big A art world, they're actually now being celebrated in the big A art world. So they're often talking to sculptors that are a part of sort of that sort of wave or aesthetic that's being made. So I definitely think people should check that out. If you want to check out some books, there's a couple different ones. Winnie Owens Hart was a professor that taught, I think she was at Howard for many years, and she wrote a book that is about sort of the lineage of craft practice that comes out of Africa and then is grown and takes new shape in the United States. And I can't see my bookshelf, so I can't remember the actual name of the book. But if you just look up Winnie Owens Hart, you can find her book.
I'll see if I can. I'll see if I can Google it, and I'll put the full thing in the show notes.
And then I also think what's important is that you diversify your sources of information. So one of the things that I really like is to cross-reference museums and what they're looking at with art centers and what we're looking at. So for instance, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum, or like say the Crocker actually is in Sacramento, like amazing museum. If you look at online the catalog of whatever they have going on, if you look at an artist you're interested in, sometimes they will reference what their research was. And they'll, at the very bottom of their article, it's footnotes. It's essentially like, we reference these 3 books in this little article. And if you cross-reference that and then start to look at the books that those curators are looking at, it's a different world. It's just not the same stuff we're looking at in art centers or that even that we maybe know in academia.
Yeah.
So I recommend you look at the footnotes. Like find an article you like, and then look at the footnotes.
Okay. Oh, I appreciate that.
it's something that's really interesting to just talk about and think about from the ground level experience, because I talk to Lindsey all the time about how, like, from my perspective, whenever I go to any clay convention whatsoever, it's usually a very specific type of person. But from the traditionalist point of view, it's almost never represented by those people. Like the Celadons and the Shinos and the Tenmokus and the Kakis, right? And even techniques such as sgraffito and like inline techniques, almost none of those came from America. Those are all things that were somehow borrowed and even on a commercial level appropriated for a sellable avenue, right? So like when you talk to a historical like Celadon potter, he's going to tell you like whatever you're selling in stores, like black Celadon is not a thing. Like red Celadon is not a thing. They have taken it, they've packaged it for you and made like a faux version of it to, you know, and so a lot of the, for lack of a better term, I don't know if appropriation is the right term, but I don't want to use the word bastardization as well, right? But a lot of the things that have been transferred and changed over for a sellable market in America is usually sold to people who don't think about the roots of those techniques and items that are being sold back to them. And I think that's a really important thing to keep a track of, is like almost none of the stuff we use is from us. You know what I mean? And like we have to pay homage somehow to that.
And this is the American tendency. Like what we've done historically in the States is as soon as it hits American soil, we own it, quote unquote.
Yeah.
You know, and that we do that with food, we do that with music, we do that with all these different things.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I found is our generation of makers is now trying to fight against that by educating themselves on where things come from. And I really appreciate that because I think we're going to be the people that are teaching others in our classes or in our workshops or in lectures or through our podcasts.
Yeah.
Like we get to say, actually, no, there's a much richer, deeper history full of amazing, creative people. Let's take a look at them. You know, let's do some research and figure out how Celadon developed in China or any of the things.
I'm so infatuated with glaze because like I don't have the availability to make the Celadon that I would see at like maybe the De Young Museum. So when I go to the De Young and I see Celadon, my Potter brain goes, that's the same color and the same opacity, maybe yes, but that's a completely different world from what I'm able to accomplish today because of mineral depletion and just like the knowledge that wasn't passed down properly because of maybe just appropriation and you know the English kind of taking but not understanding how to use it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much. There's so much. Well, to make sure this doesn't become a 2-hour podcast, I do have a fun last question for you, Ben. If there was an alternate universe Ben Carter, what would he have done for a living? So if you weren't in pottery, if you weren't doing podcasting, if you were in a completely different universe, what would be your other career?
I love this question.
Yeah. It assumes that whatever you're going to do, you're also just as successful as you are now as well.
Yes,
If that makes sense.
Okay. Well, my silly answer is that I would build pools.
Oh my gosh, what?
Because I love pools. You
Oh
know,
my
like
God.
I grew up swimming. I grew up around water. I used to be a lifeguard back in the day. Like I have spent so much time in water in my life. And there are some people's backyards and even public pools that are amazing that have like the waterfalls. So you have the sound experience. You got a little slide going down. And it's basically shaping the human experience, but in a very different way. You know, like it's not about making an object. It's about how do I get the human body to move in a specific way.
I literally just got chills. That's such a fascinating way of thinking about pools. Literally never crossed my mind before. Oh my God.
Well, I was such a public pool kid. Like, what's weird about New Jersey, I live in New Jersey now, a lot of people have private pools. And when we moved into our house, we actually had a pool in the back that was kind of derelict, like it needed a lot of work. We ended up taking the pool out, and it made me realize, like, if I could build a pool, what would I do? You know, like, what shape would it be? Who would it be for? And so I love this idea that a public pool that everyone can have access to. So it's not about necessarily like a high income person having this experience, but like, let's say you had a pool that's almost like a water park, but it's for your average 5-year-old that can go, because have you ever seen a 5-year-old jump off of a diving board? Like their life is complete the moment they jump, you know, like they're so happy.
Oh my God, so true.
So I think I would do that somehow.
Oh, I love that. Oh, that's fantastic.
I was watching a YouTube video on like the most extravagant houses, and the most impressive pool I've ever seen was this maybe 13-year-old girl who had her own room, but there was a like you pulled off this panel at the bottom of her floor and it led into a slide. And the slide constantly had little bits of water coming down it from the inside. Right. So it never touched her room. It was somehow built into the slide itself. And it slid all the way down into an outdoor pool, which then led into the yard. And she's like, yeah, I could just escape through this hatch anytime. I just have to make sure like my clothes don't get wet. My dad wanted me to have this like in case of a fire, but also it's just fun because we've never had a fire. And I'm like, oh my God, you have a pool as an escape hatch, Tamra?
That's amazing.
I feel like that's a video game come to life.
Yeah, seriously. Like unlock the
be like, this is
level.
normal.
Amazing. May we all have such joy in our lives as that child being able to escape into the pool.
Yeah.
All right, Ben. Well, where can people find you if they want to follow you and follow the work that you're involved in?
So on Instagram, you can find my work at Carter Pottery. And then I have the Brickyard Network, which people can find at brickyardnetwork.org. And you can also follow us on Instagram. And then I also want to plug History of Ceramics, because you were asking me about ceramic history earlier. And that's an Instagram that I started, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. And it's all posting from digital collections from places like the Harvard Art Museum, the Met Museum. And I'm thinking about it like I'm fishing, like I'm putting out these images of amazing historical ceramics. And what I hope is that I'm going to reel in a ceramic person that loves that pot, and then they'll use the research that's available in the caption to then go on their own research journey.
Yeah.
So you can find that at just History of Ceramics.
That's so cool. It's funny. I followed History of Ceramics, and it literally wasn't until I was like getting ready for this interview and like prepping stuff that I realized it was you who ran that. I was like, he does everything. This is amazing. So yeah, I really appreciate all the different pies that you have your fingers in. So
I'm
yeah.
just like, who
for
does this? Oh, it's Ben. Okay, yeah, of course.
Ben. Yeah. This thing. Oh yeah, it's also Ben.
It's also Ben. Yeah.
Well, there's a reason for this, actually, and I'll tell you, I'll make this story quick. But when I was about 24, I was at the University of Florida, which I would later go to graduate school at, but I was there for what's called a post-bac program, which is like an extra undergraduate year. And I applied for everything. I applied for exhibitions. I applied to get into graduate school, and I got denied everything. Like just rejection letter after rejection letter after rejection letter. And at that point, I realized like I have to make my own path in ceramics because my pots aren't the type of pots where like everybody wants to buy them. Like I'm not the most popular aesthetically, but I feel like I have something to offer. So whenever I have an idea like History of Ceramics, I just do it because no one's going to do it for me. I have to be the one to do it. I can't wait for someone else to do it.
That's the mentality.
Yeah, if you're a young person out there that's listening and you have a good idea that you can give your community something, don't wait for someone else to do it. Just do it. That my book's ultimately this low fire book that I just wrote. I just had to do it. Like I thought someone else would maybe write it, and no one else is going to write it if it's not me. So I just encourage y'all to just like take the leap. Whatever you think you need to do, just do it.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been an awesome conversation, and yeah, so appreciate you being here.
Well, thank y'all. Good to be here.
We really enjoy having you on, honestly.
And scene. Marker.
And that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Mud Peddlers. We would love to hear from you, so if you want to share your thoughts about the episodes or just see what Donte and I are working on in our studios, come say hi. You can find links to my social media at lindseymdillon.com. That's LINDSEY, M as in monster, DILLON.com.
And you can visit my pottery shop or see what I'm working on at earthnationceramics.com. And you can find me all over social media at Earth Nation Ceramics. It's spelled exactly how you think it's spelled.
And if you want to support the show, hear some bonus episodes, and see some behind the scenes of my work, you can support me and the show at patreon.com/LindseyMDillon. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.